Here's a little known detail that often gets overlooked while some ascetic practices discouraged frequent bathing. Many monastic orders did maintain a certain level of hygiene, particularly for practical reasons. For instance, the washing of hands and feet was often a communal ritual, symbolizing humility and hospitality. And while full immersion baths might be rare, some monasteries had facilities for basic washing, especially for the sick or for specific religious rites. It wasn't a universal condemnation of all washing, but rather a reprioritization of spiritual over physical indulgence. It's like saying, I'm not against eating, but I'm certainly against gluttony. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era where the simple act of washing might just have been considered a death wish. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across rough-hewn stone walls. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, and something heavy, an invisible dread that clings to every breath. You're bundled in layers of wool, not just for warmth, but as a barrier, a flimsy shield against the unseen horrors that lurk in the very air you breathe. The streets outside are muddy, filled with refuse, and the distant clang of a bell tolls for yet another soul lost to the pervasive, silent enemy. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this world, let alone thrive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The academic debate that continues to challenge historians is the precise extent to which Christian doctrine directly influenced the decline of bathing in the Middle Ages, versus simply reflecting and reinforcing existing societal trends driven by economic and epidemiological factors. Some scholars argue that the Church's emphasis on spiritual purity provided a theological justification for the abandonment of Roman bathing practices. Others contend that the Church merely adapted its teachings to a reality already shaped by practical concerns and fears of disease, finding spiritual meaning in what was already becoming a necessity. It's a complex interplay of faith, fear, and practicality. You find yourself in the heart of the Middle Ages, a time often romanticized with knights and castles, but in reality, a period overshadowed by a pervasive, chilling terror disease. And not just any disease, but the kind that sweeps through populations like an apocalyptic wave, leaving devastation in its wake. The most infamous, of course, is the Black Death, a name that still sends shivers down your spine even centuries later. Imagine living under that constant, looming threat. Every cough, every sneeze, every feverish brow could be the harbinger of your end, or worse, the end of everyone you hold dear. This wasn't a world of antibiotics or germ theory. It was a world where illness was a mysterious, often divine punishment, or perhaps the work of malevolent spirits. And in this climate of fear, even something as seemingly innocuous as a bath could become a source of profound anxiety. You can imagine the subtle pressures at play. If your spiritual leaders preached humility and detachment from worldly pleasures, and if the very act of bathing was already associated with the dangers of disease, it would be easy to conflate the two. To avoid bathing could be seen as both a pious act and a practical measure for survival. Why risk your soul and your life for a bit of clean skin? A devout neighbor might ask you, with genuine concern in their eyes. The common historical fact you'll quickly grasp is that the Black Death, which peaked in Europe between 1347 and 1351, wiped out an estimated 30% to 60% of the continent's population. Think about that for a moment. More than half the people you know, gone. Your village, your town, perhaps even your entire region, decimated. The sheer scale of the mortality is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Living in an age of relatively effective public health measures and medical understanding. But for you, living in the 14th century, it was a brutal, undeniable reality. The air itself felt poisoned. The ground seemed to absorb the suffering, and every interaction carried a whisper of contagion. This isn't to say that all medieval people were unwashed ascetics. Far from it. But the prevailing cultural narrative, heavily influenced by religious teachings, certainly shifted the emphasis away from the kind of communal, luxurious bathing that was once common. for the common folk, whose lives were already hard. The idea of adding another laborious task like heating bathwater, especially when it was viewed with suspicion, would have been a low priority. In such a world, the concept of cleanliness was radically different from our modern understanding. You see, the prevailing medical theory of the time was the humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posited that your body was composed of 4 primary fluids, or humer's blood: yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was a delicate balance of these humors, and illness was a result of an imbalance. This might seem like a quaint, almost comical idea to you now, but it was the bedrock of all medical knowledge, influencing everything from diet to daily routines. The concept of spiritual cleanliness became paramount. Confession, penance, and participation in religious rituals were seen as the true means of purifying oneself. Physical dirt was often seen as less significant than the stains on one's soul. You might attend church, feeling the rough wool of your tunic against your skin, knowing that your spiritual state was far more important than any earthly grime. It was a different kind of inner glow they sought. Now, here's where bathing gets tricky. The fear wasn't just of the disease itself, but of how it entered the body. Many believed that disease, or miasma, was carried in the air of foul, corrupt vapor emanating from decaying matter, swamps, or even unwashed bodies. This miasma would then enter your body through its various orifices, including, crucially, the pores of your skin. And what did bathing do? In their minds, it opened those pores. This religious perspective also influenced how people treated illness. If disease was seen as a divine punishment or a test of faith, then the response was often prayer, pilgrimage, and seeking spiritual remedies, rather than solely medical ones. While physicians still practiced, their methods were often intertwined with religious rituals. A bath, in this context, might be seen as an attempt to circumvent God's will, or to rely on worldly means rather than divine intervention. Imagine the logic: you immerse yourself in water, especially warm water, and your skin. That protective barrier becomes porous, inviting the very pestilence you so desperately wish to avoid. It's like opening the drawbridge to a castle under siege. Why would you willingly invite the enemy in, they might ask you, looking at your modern insistence on daily showers with utter bewilderment. This wasn't just a casual aversion, it was a deeply ingrained, almost scientific, belief based on the best available knowledge of the time. Consider the Crusades, a common historical event during the Middle Ages. While European crusaders often encountered more sophisticated bathing practices in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, they didn't necessarily adopt them upon their return. Their own cultural and religious biases, combined with the practical difficulties of replicating such practices in their homelands, meant that the influence was limited. It's a bit like visiting a fancy restaurant and then going home to your usual meal. Sometimes the old habits are just too ingrained. So while you might occasionally take a bath, perhaps once a month or even less frequently, it would be done with extreme caution. You wouldn't linger in the water. You might use cold water, believing it would keep your pores closed, or add herbs and oils to the water. Not for fragrance, but for their supposed medicinal or protective properties. The idea of a long, hot, leisurely soak, as you might enjoy today, would be utterly alien, perhaps even reckless. So you find yourself navigating a world where the very act of cleanliness is viewed through a spiritual lens. To be clean means to be pure in heart and soul, to be free from sin, rather than to be free from dirt. The body is a temporary vessel, and its care is secondary to the eternal destiny of the soul. This perspective, combined with the medical fears of miasma and open pores, created a powerful cultural barrier to widespread bathing. Here's a little-known detail that might surprise you. While full immersion baths were viewed with suspicion, partial washing was still common, especially for the hands and face. You might use a basin of water and a cloth to wipe away visible dirt, or use a dry cloth to rub down your skin. It wasn't about achieving a deep clean, but about maintaining a certain level of presentability and removing superficial grime. Think of it less like a cleansing ritual and more like a quick dusting. You'd prioritize wiping away the visible evidence of the world, rather than risking the invisible dangers of water. You might even find a certain comfort in this worldview. If your lack of bathing is a sign of your piety, then the judgment of others matters less. You're not dirty, you're devout. It's a clever psychological shift, allowing people to reconcile their practical limitations with their spiritual aspirations. A joke might be, why did the medieval saint never complain about body odor? Because he was too busy smelling the sweet scent of salvation. It's a humorous take on a serious cultural phenomenon. The fear of miasma also meant that people took great pains to avoid foul smells. You might carry pomanders small, perforated containers filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, civet, or herbs to ward off the bad air. You'd sprinkle fragrant herbs on your floors and burn incense in your homes. The goal was to create a pleasant, clean scent, believing that good smells could counteract the harmful effects of bad ones. It was a sensory defense mechanism, a constant battle against the invisible forces of disease. You'd walk through the streets, holding a perfumed cloth to your nose, not out of snobbery, but out of a genuine, if misguided, attempt at self-preservation. As you drift deeper into sleep, reflect on how faith, fear, and practicality intertwined to shape the medieval understanding of hygiene. The body, once a canvas for Roman indulgence, became a vessel to be disciplined and purified through spiritual means. The very act of washing, once a social ritual, transformed into a cautious, often avoided practice, overshadowed by the weight of both medical theory and religious conviction. It's a profound reminder of how deeply cultural beliefs can influence even the most personal aspects of daily life. The academic debate that still lingers today is whether the decline in bathing practices during the late Middle Ages was solely due to the fear of disease, or if other factors, such as the rising cost of fuel for heating bathwater, the increasing influence of Christian asceticism, which sometimes viewed excessive bodily indulgence, including bathing, as sinful, or even the simple practicality of limited access to clean, warm water for the masses, played an equally significant role. Historians still debate whether the fear of disease was the primary driver or merely one of several contributing factors to the shift away from the more frequent bathing habits of earlier eras. It's a complex tapestry of social, economic, religious, and medical beliefs, all interwoven. As you continue to navigate the murky waters of medieval hygiene, it becomes impossible to ignore the very real, tangible dangers that lurked in the water sources themselves. While the medieval mind was preoccupied with the invisible miasma and the perceived threat of open pores, the actual threat was often far more prosaic, contaminated water. You might also notice that the concept of personal space was very different. People lived in close quarters, often sharing beds and utensils. The idea of individual hygiene, as we understand it, was not a dominant concern. Your personal cleanliness was often secondary to the communal effort of survival. If a plague was sweeping through, your focus would be on avoiding contact with the sick, praying for divine intervention, and perhaps fleeing the infected areas, not on taking a refreshing dip. The common historical fact you'll quickly grasp is that medieval urban centers, and even many rural areas, lacked sophisticated sanitation systems. Rivers and streams, which served as sources of drinking water, were often also used for disposing of human and animal waste. Industrial effluent from tanneries, for example, and general refuse. Wells, while seemingly cleaner, could easily become contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or overflowing ditches. Imagine dipping your bucket into a well, not knowing what invisible horrors might be swirling beneath the surface. A silent, deadly cocktail of bacteria and parasites. And let's be real, the water sources themselves were often questionable. Rivers and streams that served as drinking water also served as dumping grounds for waste. Wells could be contaminated. The idea of immersing yourself in such water, especially if you believed it opened your pores, would be terrifying. It wasn't just a theoretical fear, the water was often genuinely unsafe, though not for the reasons they understood. You'd be more likely to get sick from drinking the water than from bathing in it. But the prevailing wisdom focused on the act of bathing itself as the vector for disease. This lack of clean water infrastructure meant that even if people wanted to bathe frequently, the water available was often far from pristine. The very act of immersing oneself in such water, particularly if it was warm and allowed the pores to open, would indeed have been a health risk, though not for the reasons they understood. It wasn't the opening of pores that was the danger, but the teeming microscopic life within the water itself. You might recall the joke about the noble avoiding the bath due to plague. A more accurate, if less humorous, version might be, why did the peasant avoid the river because he didn't want to drink his neighbor's yesterday's dinner? So you learn to adapt. You wear your clothes for longer periods, perhaps airing them out or brushing off dirt. You might use dry rubbing with cloths or even sand to exfoliate and clean your skin. Your hair might be treated with powders or perfumes to absorb oils and mask odors. It's a world of dry cleaning, long before the invention of modern dry cleaning. You might even find yourself laughing, a little darkly, at the irony of it all. You're trying so hard to avoid disease, and in doing so, you're embracing practices that, from a modern perspective, might seem counterintuitive to good health. It's a testament to the power of belief, even when that belief is based on incomplete information. Here's a little-known detail that highlights the practical challenges in many medieval towns. Water was often sold by water carriers. These individuals would draw water from communal wells or rivers and transport it to individual homes, often in large barrels or skins. The quality of this water was highly variable, and it could easily become contaminated during transport or storage. Imagine your daily water supply arriving in a barrel that also carried water for washing clothes, or worse, for watering livestock. The chain of custody for clean water was tenuous at best, making truly hygienic practices a constant uphill battle. The fear was palpable, a constant companion. Every sniffle, every ache, every new bump on your skin would send a jolt of panic through you. And in this environment, the idea of willingly exposing your body to the very element believed to invite sickness, water, became an act of profound folly. You'd rather endure a certain level of grime than risk the terrifying, invisible enemy that water was believed to usher in. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? The very thing we associate with cleanliness and health today was, for you in the Middle Ages, a potential gateway to death. The academic debate that still engages historians is the relative impact of actual waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, or typhoid versus the miasmatic theory in shaping medieval bathing habits. While the fear of miasma was a powerful psychological deterrent, the very real and observable outbreaks of illness linked to contaminated water sources undoubtedly reinforced the idea that water itself could be dangerous. Historians still debate whether the theoretical fear of miasma or the practical experience of waterborne illness was the stronger driver in discouraging bathing. It's a complex interplay where real dangers fed into existing, though misguided, theories. This deep-seated fear shaped daily life in countless ways, influencing not just personal hygiene but also public health policies. Such as they were, towns might implement quarantines or burn the possessions of the deceased, but the underlying understanding of disease transmission remained rooted in the miasmatic theory. You'd see people carrying flowers or herbs to their noses, believing the sweet scents would purify the air and protect them from the noxious fumes of illness. It was a constant, desperate struggle against an invisible foe, and every decision, even about something as simple as washing, was weighed against the terrifying possibility of contagion. You can imagine the constant struggle to find potable water. For drinking, you might prefer beer or ale, as the brewing process involved boiling, which inadvertently sterilized the water. This is a common historical fact. Medieval people drank a lot of low-alcohol beer partly because it was safer than water. You might find yourself reaching for a tankard of weak ale in the morning. Not because you're a heavy drinker, but because it's simply the safest option for hydration. It's a strange thought, isn't it? Your breakfast beverage was also your public health measure. You might also notice that the wealthy, while having more access to resources, didn't necessarily bathe more frequently. Their approach to hygiene might involve more elaborate perfumes, finer linens, and more frequent changes of clothing. But the fundamental fear of water and open pores remained. A joke might circulate among the common folk. Why did the noble never take a bath? Because he didn't want to open his pores to the plague. Of course, it's a dark humor, born of desperation, but it highlights the pervasive nature of the belief across all social strata. The visual evidence of this contamination would have been everywhere. Open sewers ran through streets. Waste was often dumped directly into rivers, and animal carcasses might be left to rot. The air would have been heavy with the stench of decay and human waste, reinforcing the miasmatic theory. Bad smells equal bad air equals disease. So, while they correctly identified a link between foulness and illness, they misunderstood the mechanism. They thought the smell caused the disease. Not that the sources of the smell were also breeding grounds for unseen pathogens. The fear of disease wasn't just a fleeting panic. It was an enduring psychological burden that permeated every aspect of existence. It influenced diet, travel, social gatherings, and, yes, even personal hygiene. You lived with the constant awareness that death could strike at any moment, from any direction, and the belief that water could be a conduit for that death was a powerful deterrent. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained beliefs, even those based on flawed science, can shape human behavior for centuries. This misunderstanding had profound consequences for public health. Instead of investing in clean water systems or proper waste disposal, efforts were often directed at masking odors or avoiding perceived bad air. You might see town officials ordering the removal of particularly noxious piles of refuse, not because they understood germ theory, but because the smell was unbearable and believed to be a source of plague. It was a reactive, rather than preventative, approach to public health. So, as you drift off tonight, consider the simple luxury of your own warm, clean shower, the steam, the soap, the feeling of fresh water on your skin. These are things you take for granted, but for someone living in the shadow of the Black Death, they would have seemed like an invitation to disaster. You'd choose the comforting layers of dirt and the protective barrier of closed pores over the terrifying vulnerability of a bath. It's a world where cleanliness meant something entirely different, something far more perilous. The wealthy might have had slightly better access to cleaner water, perhaps from private wells or springs on their estates, but they were not immune to the widespread contamination. Even a noble's private bath, filled with water drawn from a seemingly clean source, could still harbor unseen dangers. It was a universal problem, affecting all strata of society, though perhaps with varying degrees of severity. You might hear a lord complaining about a flux of the bowels after a rare bath, further solidifying his belief that water was indeed a dangerous element. As you continue your journey through the Middle Ages, the concept of the body and its vulnerabilities becomes even clearer. We touched upon the humoral theory, that ancient idea that your health hinged on the balance of 4 vital fluids. But let's really sink into what that meant for your daily life, especially when it came to something as seemingly simple as your skin. So, while the medieval fear of bathing was rooted in the miasmatic theory and the concept of open pores, there was an underlying, very real danger that they inadvertently avoided by shunning water. They were right to be wary of the water, but for the wrong reasons. It's a tragic irony. A blind man accidentally avoiding a pit because he thought a ghost was in it, when in reality, the pit was simply too deep to traverse safely. The prevailing wisdom passed down through generations of physicians and common folk alike was that your skin was not just a covering, but a crucial living membrane. And on this membrane were countless tiny openings, your pores. To you in the 21st century, pores are just pores. They let your skin breathe. They release sweat. They can get clogged with dirt and oil. But to someone in the Middle Ages, these pores were far more significant, far more dangerous. They were gateways. This constant threat of waterborne illness meant that even simple acts like washing food or hands were done with caution, or often not done thoroughly enough. You might quickly rinse vegetables in a stream, unaware that the very water you're using is teeming with bacteria. The concept of boiling water for purification, beyond brewing, was not widely understood or consistently practiced for general consumption or hygiene. Imagine your body as a fortress. Your skin is the outer wall, formidable and protective. But those pores, they're like tiny, unguarded gates. And the enemy, remember, is miasma, that foul, unseen vapor-carrying disease. The logic, from their perspective, was ironclad if you open those gates. You invite the enemy right in. And what was the most effective way to throw open those gates? Warm water. As you drift off to sleep, consider the silent, invisible enemies that lurked in every medieval water source. The fear of bathing, while scientifically misguided in its reasoning, was a pragmatic response to a very real, though misunderstood, threat. It's a reminder that even when people are wrong about why something is dangerous, they can still be right about the danger itself. And in the Middle Ages, the water, for all its life-giving properties, was often a harbinger of illness, a silent partner in the pervasive fear of disease. This is the common historical fact that truly underpins the medieval aversion to bathing, the belief that warm water caused the pores to open, making the body susceptible to disease. It wasn't just a vague superstition, it was a deeply held medical conviction. Cold water, on the other hand, was thought to constrict the pores, keeping them tightly shut and thus protecting the body. So, if you absolutely had to wash, a quick splash with cold water might be deemed acceptable, though still approached with caution. A long, hot bath, however, was seen as an act of reckless self-endangerment. It was like inviting a dragon into your living room for tea. Oh, don't mind me, just opening up my defenses for a bit of a soak. What could possibly go wrong? Now, let's turn our gaze to the fascinating, and often surprising, ways that social status and daily life intertwined with bathing habits in the Middle Ages. You might assume that the wealthy, with their greater resources, would have maintained a higher standard of personal cleanliness. But as you've already seen, the medieval aversion to bathing was driven by a complex web of medical beliefs, religious attitudes, and practical limitations that transcended simple economic means. This fear extended beyond just disease. The humors themselves were believed to exit and enter the body through these pores. If your humors were out of balance, a bath, especially a warm one, could exacerbate the problem by allowing the bad humors to escape too quickly, or by allowing bad air to enter and further disrupt the delicate equilibrium. It was a constant balancing act, and every action, every meal, every exposure to the elements was considered in terms of its effect on your internal harmony. You might joke, "My humors are feeling a bit off today. Perhaps I should avoid that puddle, lest my phlegm decides to make a break for it." The common historical fact is that while the wealthy certainly had more access to resources, their bathing habits were still infrequent by modern standards, and often focused on partial washing and the liberal use of perfumes and clean linens, rather than full immersion baths. A lord or lady might have a private wooden tub, a luxury unavailable to most peasants, but it wouldn't be filled daily or even weekly. Instead, servants would bring basins of water for washing hands and face, and perhaps a damp cloth for wiping down the body. The emphasis was on maintaining an outward appearance of freshness, often achieved through clean outer garments and strong scents, rather than a deep, full body cleanse. Here's a little known detail about this belief. Some medieval medical texts actually recommended sealing the pores after any necessary washing. This might involve rubbing the skin with certain oils, salves, or even a fine powder. The idea was to quickly close those vulnerable gateways before any miasma could sneak in. It's a bit like putting a tiny, invisible padlock on every single pore on your body. You'd probably spend more time trying to seal yourself up than you did actually washing. It makes you wonder if they ever felt truly clean, or just perpetually sealed. Imagine a noblewoman preparing for a courtly event. She wouldn't be stepping into a steaming bath. Instead, she might have her ladies-in-waiting meticulously brush her hair, apply fragrant powders to her skin, and dress her in multiple layers of freshly laundered linen undergarments beneath her elaborate gown. Her silks and velvets, too precious to wash frequently, would be aired out and perhaps gently beaten to remove dust. The goal was to present an image of refinement and pleasantness, a stark contrast to the common perception of the unwashed masses. One bath a year keeps the plague away, but fresh linen every day keeps the gossip at bay. She might quip to her maid, a wry smile playing on her lips. The academic debate that still swirls around this particular aspect is the extent to which this belief about pores was a direct continuation of ancient medical thought versus an adaptation or exaggeration of it in response to the specific epidemiological pressures of the Middle Ages, particularly the recurring plagues. Some historians argue that while the humoral theory was ancient, the intense fear of open pores as a vector for disease became far more pronounced and widespread during the medieval period, almost as a coping mechanism for an incomprehensible threat. Others suggest it was a natural evolution of existing theories, simply applied more rigorously. Here's a little-known detail that sheds light on the practices of the elite. Some wealthy households would use dry baths or sweat baths, which involved sitting in a heated room or using heated cloths to induce sweating, followed by a vigorous rubbing down with dry cloths or even sand. This was seen as a way to cleanse the body by expelling humors and impurities through sweat. without the perceived dangers of water opening the pores. It was a more controlled form of purification, aligning with the humoral theory and a far cry from a refreshing soak. You might find yourself in such a room, feeling the heat seep into your bones, then being rubbed down with a surprisingly coarse fabric, leaving your skin tingling but not wet. You can imagine the conversations. Did you hear about poor Agnes bathed last week, and now she's got the sweating sickness? Of course, Agnes might have caught the sweating sickness from any number of sources, but in a world desperate for explanations, the bath became the convenient culprit. It reinforced the existing belief, creating a vicious cycle of fear and avoidance. It's a bit like blaming your internet connection for your bad mood. Sometimes it's true, but often there are deeper, more complex issues at play. The academic debate that still occupies historians is the degree to which social status influenced the perception of cleanliness versus actual hygienic practices. While the elite could afford more elaborate masking agents and cleaner clothing, were they genuinely healthier or just better at appearing so? Some argue that the visible markers of wealth, fine clothes, perfumes, and less manual labor, naturally led to a cleaner appearance, regardless of bathing frequency. Others contend that the very act of being able to afford these dry methods did offer a marginal, if misunderstood, health benefit by reducing surface grime. It's a question of whether appearances truly reflected reality, or if they were merely a sophisticated illusion. This belief system also meant that other forms of cleansing were preferred. Remember the dry rubbing we talked about? That was seen as perfectly safe because it didn't involve water opening the pores? Changing clothes frequently was another key method of hygiene, as it was believed that fresh linens would absorb impurities from the skin and keep the body clean without the risk of water exposure. You might own several sets of tunics and shifts, changing them regularly, perhaps even daily if you were wealthy enough. The laundress might be the busiest person in the household, far busier than anyone preparing a bath. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the artisans, the common laborers, bathing was an even rarer event, driven by sheer practicality and necessity. Their lives were physically demanding, often spent outdoors or in workshops, accumulating dirt and sweat. Access to large quantities of warm water was a significant challenge. A bath might only occur a few times a year, perhaps before major religious festivals, or if one was ill and a medicinal bath was prescribed. These baths would likely be taken in a shared tub, with the water being used by multiple family members in order of seniority, from the cleanest the head of the household to the dirtiest. You'd probably be last, watching the water turn increasingly opaque with each successive bather. At least it's still warm, you might sigh, trying to find a clean spot in the murky depths. Consider the wealthy. They had access to more elaborate fabrics, more changes of clothing, and more powerful perfumes. Their approach to hygiene was less about washing the skin directly and more about masking odors and maintaining an outward appearance of cleanliness through fresh garments. A rich lord might boast, "I haven't seen a drop of bathwater in a month, but my silks are fresh, and my pomander is full." Who needs a bath when you have good tailoring and a strong scent? It was a different kind of clean, one that prioritized the surface over the substance. The concept of public hygiene for the common folk was almost non-existent. Waste disposal was rudimentary, and living quarters were often cramped and shared with animals. The pervasive odors and grime were simply a part of daily life, something to be endured. Your sense of smell would quickly adapt, or perhaps simply shut down, to the constant assault. It was a world where cleanliness was a luxury, not a given. The irony, of course, is that by avoiding water, people were inadvertently creating environments ripe for bacterial growth and the spread of other diseases that weren't transmitted by miasma. But they didn't know about bacteria or viruses. To them, the logic was sound: if you keep the gates closed, the enemy stays out. It's a tragic misunderstanding, a medical blind spot that had profound consequences for public health and personal habits. You might find yourself wanting to shout, "Just wash your hands and for goodness sake," on that, but they wouldn't understand. Even within urban settings where more people lived in close proximity, the focus remained on managing waste away from immediate living spaces, rather than on personal washing. Town regulations might dictate where refuse could be dumped or how often streets should be cleaned. But these were broad public health measures, not directives for individual bathing. You'd see the night soil collectors making their rounds, emptying privies, a vital but unpleasant service that kept the worst of the waste from overflowing into the streets. Even medical treatments were influenced by this poor-centric view. If you were ill, a physician might prescribe sweating to expel bad humors, but they would be very careful about how that sweat was managed, often using dry heat or specific herbs rather than water to induce it. The idea was to encourage the pores to open just enough to release the harmful humors, but not so much that new miasma could enter. It was a delicate dance, a constant negotiation with your own skin. You might even hear a physician say, "We must encourage the humors to flee, but gently, gently, lest we invite new guests to the party." Consider the notion of clean hands. While hand washing before meals was sometimes practiced, especially in wealthier households, it was often a quick rinse rather than a thorough scrub with soap. The understanding of germ transmission was absent, so the true efficacy of such washing was limited. You might see a lord dip his fingers into a basin of rose water before a feast, a gesture of refinement rather than a rigorous attempt at sanitation. "My hands are clean enough for the king," he might declare, oblivious to the invisible world beneath his fingernails. This deep-seated fear of water and open pores permeated not just medical theory but also popular culture and folk wisdom. Stories might circulate about people who fell ill after visiting a bathhouse, reinforcing the dangerous perception. Children would be warned, "Don't play in that water too long, or the bad air will get in." It was a lesson learned early and carried throughout life, a fundamental tenet of survival in a world where invisible threats lurked everywhere. The differences in hygiene practices between social classes were less about a fundamental difference in belief about bathing's dangers, and more about the practical realities of life. The wealthy could afford to mask their lack of cleanliness more effectively and create a more pleasant environment around themselves. The poor simply lived with the grime, their bodies hardened by labor and their senses dulled by necessity. It was a stark visual representation of the social hierarchy, where even the air you breathed and the cleanliness you experienced were dictated by your birthright. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, reflect on how a simple misunderstanding of biology could shape an entire civilization's approach to cleanliness. The pores, those tiny, essential openings on your skin, became symbols of vulnerability, gateways to illness and death, and water. The very essence of life and cleanliness to us was seen as a treacherous accomplice, ready to betray your body to the unseen forces of disease. It's a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, glimpse into a past where the most basic acts of hygiene were fraught with peril. So, as you prepare to close your eyes, consider the varied approaches to cleanliness across the medieval social spectrum. From the perfumed linens of the nobility to the shared, murky bathwater of the peasantry, hygiene was a complex and often contradictory affair, shaped by beliefs, resources, and the harsh realities of a world without germ theory. It's a reminder that even the most personal habits can be deeply intertwined with the broader social fabric of an era. Now, let's rewind a bit, before the full grip of the Black Death and the pervasive fear of open pores took hold. Imagine a different time, a time when bathing was not just tolerated, but celebrated. We're talking about the glory days of the Roman Empire, where grand public bathhouses known as thermae were not merely places to get clean, but bustling social hubs, centers of culture, exercise, and even business. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent of a combined gym, spa, library, and coffee shop. You'd go there to bathe, certainly, but also to exercise, meet friends, discuss politics, and generally see and be seen. Despite the widespread aversion to bathing for general hygiene, there was one specific circumstance where water, often combined with other substances, was not only tolerated but actively prescribed for medicinal purposes. In a world grappling with illness and lacking modern pharmaceuticals, the healing properties of nature were paramount, and certain washes were believed to be vital for recovery or alleviation of symptoms. The common historical fact here is that Roman bathhouses were incredibly sophisticated and widespread, featuring intricate plumbing, heating systems, the hypocaust system, which heated floors and walls, and various rooms for different temperatures of water. The frigidarium cold, tepidarium warm, and caldarium hot. They were engineering marvels, testaments to Roman ingenuity and their appreciation for hygiene and leisure. You could spend hours there, moving from one pool to another, getting a massage, even having a snack. It was a daily ritual for many, a cornerstone of urban life. The common historical fact is that while general bathing was infrequent, medicinal washes and herbal poultices were commonly used to treat specific ailments, wounds, and skin conditions. These weren't about overall cleanliness in the modern sense, but about targeted therapeutic applications. If you suffered from a fever, a skin rash, or an infected wound, a physician or local healer might prescribe a wash made from specific herbs steeped in water or even wine, believing these concoctions possessed healing powers. The water here was merely a vehicle for the medicinal properties of the herbs, not a cleansing agent in itself. But as the Roman Empire began its long, slow decline, so too did these magnificent structures. The reasons are complex, a tapestry woven from economic hardship, political instability, and shifting social priorities. Maintaining these vast complexes required immense resources, constant supplies of fresh water, enormous quantities of wood for fuel to heat the water, and a dedicated workforce for maintenance and operation. As the empire fractured and its economy faltered, the funds and infrastructure necessary to keep these baths running simply dwindled. You can imagine the local governor staring at the ledger, sighing. Another ton of wood for the caldarium, can't we just not... Imagine a village healer hunched over a simmering pot, stirring a brew of chamomile, a plantain, and perhaps a touch of willow bark. This wasn't for a relaxing soak, but a potent, often bitter-smelling liquid destined to be applied to a swollen joint or a feverish brow. You might be instructed to soak a cloth in this warm infusion and apply it directly to the affected area, or perhaps to gently wash a wound with it. The focus was entirely on the medicinal properties, not on the act of washing for its own sake. This will draw out the bad humors, the healer might gravely inform you, and close the wound to the foul air. Here's a little known detail about the decline as cities shrank and populations became more ruralized. The very concept of a large public gathering place like a bathhouse became less practical and, in some cases, even dangerous. With less centralized control and more localized conflicts, these large open spaces could become targets or simply fall into disrepair due to neglect. The aqueducts that once fed them with pristine water might crumble, or be deliberately sabotaged during times of war. Imagine the grand arches of a once-flowing aqueduct now cracked and dry, a silent monument to a bygone era of abundance. Here's a little-known detail that highlights the specificity of these medicinal washes. Some medieval medical texts describe elaborate recipes for bath waters that were tailored to specific humoral imbalances. For example, a person with an excess of cold and wet humors might be prescribed a bath infused with hot and dry herbs like rosemary or thyme, intended to restore balance. These were less about getting clean and more about recalibrating the body's internal chemistry. It's like a very early, very herbal form of personalized medicine, where the bath was a delivery system for therapeutic agents rather than a hygiene tool. You might find yourself immersed in a fragrant, but not particularly soapy, concoction, hoping its vapors would work their magic. The academic debate that still occupies historians is the precise timeline and primary drivers for the abandonment of these Roman bathhouses. Was it a sudden collapse due to barbarian invasions, or a gradual decay over centuries as economic and social structures shifted? Some argue that the rise of Christianity, with its emphasis on spiritual purity over bodily indulgence, played a significant role in discouraging public bathing. Others contend that practical concerns like the cost of fuel and maintenance were far more impactful. It's a chicken and egg question: did the decline in bathing lead to a shift in attitudes? Or did changing attitudes contribute to the decline of the baths? The academic debate that still exists among historians is the true efficacy of these medieval medicinal washes. While some herbs undoubtedly possessed antiseptic or anti-inflammatory properties, the overall understanding of disease transmission meant that many treatments were based on flawed theories. Historians still debate whether the perceived benefits were due to genuine pharmacological effects, the placebo effect, or simply the body's natural healing process. It's a complex question of whether these washes were truly beneficial, or merely provided comfort and a sense of agency in a world where illness was so terrifyingly unpredictable. As you move deeper into the early Middle Ages, you'd see these grand Roman structures slowly falling into ruin. Some might be repurposed, a frigidarium becoming a church, a caldarium perhaps a storage facility. Others would simply be quarried for their stone, their marble stripped away to build new, smaller structures. The sophisticated plumbing systems would break down, and without the knowledge or resources to repair them, they would become useless. The gurgle of flowing water would be replaced by the whisper of wind through broken arches. You can imagine the relief, even if temporary, that these washes might provide: a cool compress on a fevered head, a soothing herbal rinse for irritated skin. These simple applications could offer genuine comfort, regardless of the underlying scientific understanding. In a time before pain relievers and antibiotics, any form of relief was welcomed. You might even feel a sense of hope, watching the steam rise from a medicinal concoction, believing it was carrying away your ailments. The loss of the baths wasn't just about losing a place to wash, it was about losing a central pillar of Roman urban life. With their disappearance, the communal aspect of hygiene diminished. Bathing became a more private, individual affair, if it happened at all. And without the constant, large-scale demand for fresh water and heating, the infrastructure that supported such widespread cleanliness also withered. You wouldn't just pop down to the local therme anymore. You'd be lucky to have a small wooden tub in your own home, if you were fortunate enough to have one. These medicinal uses of water were distinct from general bathing. They were often performed by a physician, a barber surgeon, or a knowledgeable healer, and were seen as a necessary medical intervention rather than a routine personal habit. The water used might be specially sourced, perhaps from a pure spring, or boiled extensively to prepare the herbal infusions, minimizing some of the risks of general contaminated water, though they wouldn't have understood why boiling helped. This shift also meant a change in the perception of water itself. In the Roman era, water was a symbol of civilization, health, and luxury. It flowed freely, brought to cities by impressive aqueducts. But in the fragmented world of the early Middle Ages, clean, flowing water became a precious, often scarce resource. Wells were dug, rivers were used, but the scale and purity of the Roman water supply were largely lost. And with less access to clean water, the act of bathing became more difficult, less frequent, and arguably less appealing. Even the washing of wounds, a critical part of medieval surgery and first aid, would fall into this category. While crude by modern standards, washing a wound with water, sometimes mixed with wine or vinegar, both of which have some antiseptic properties, was a recognized practice. It wasn't about making the patient clean in a general sense, but about attempting to prevent infection in a very specific, localized area. You might wince as a rough cloth is applied to a cut, but you'd endure it, knowing it was part of the healing process. Think about the practicalities. To heat enough water for a full bath in your home would require a significant amount of firewood, a precious commodity in many regions. It would also take considerable time and effort to draw the water, heat it, and then dispose of it. For most people whose lives were consumed by the daily grind of survival, farming, weaving, tending to livestock, such an undertaking was a luxury they simply couldn't afford, either in terms of resources or time. I could spend all day heating water for a bath. You might hear a peasant grumble. Or I could spend it in the fields, ensuring we have food for winter. The choice was clear. So, while the general population largely avoided full immersion baths due to fear and practicality, the world of medieval medicine carved out a specific, albeit limited, role for water. It was a tool, a carrier for the potent properties of herbs and other natural remedies, used to combat illness and alleviate suffering. It was a pragmatic exception to a deeply ingrained rule, born of necessity and the desperate search for healing in a challenging era. This economic reality, combined with the emerging medical theories about pores and miasma, created a powerful disincentive for regular bathing. It wasn't just a matter of preference. It was a confluence of factors that made frequent full-body washing seem impractical, expensive, and potentially dangerous. A joke from this era might be, what's the difference between a Roman and a medieval peasant? The Roman knew how to build a bathhouse. The peasant knew how to avoid one. It's a stark contrast that highlights the dramatic shift in societal norms. As you drift deeper into slumber, consider this nuanced view of water in the Middle Ages. Feared for its perceived ability to invite disease during general bathing, yet embraced as a vital component in the fight against illness. It's a testament to the complex, often contradictory ways that societies adapt their beliefs and practices to the realities of their world. The water, in this context, was not a symbol of cleanliness, but a vessel of hope, carrying the promise of relief in a time of widespread suffering. The church's influence, as mentioned in the academic debate, also played a role. While early Christian communities did not universally condemn bathing, and some monasteries even maintained bathhouses, the broader emphasis shifted towards spiritual cleanliness and asceticism. Excessive attention to the body, including elaborate bathing rituals, could be seen as a worldly indulgence, a distraction from the pursuit of piety. You might hear sermons warning against vanity and the temptations of the flesh, which, by extension, could include luxurious bathing. This subtle yet pervasive cultural shift contributed to the decline of the public bathhouse as a social institution. As the Middle Ages began to wane, a subtle yet significant shift began to ripple through European society, slowly challenging the long-held beliefs about bathing and hygiene. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual awakening, a tentative step towards a more modern understanding of the body and its relationship with the environment. You find yourself at the cusp of the Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in classical learning, humanism, and scientific inquiry, all of which would, in time, begin to chip away at the medieval mindset. So you find yourself in a world where the grand communal baths are a distant memory, their ruins overgrown with ivy, their heating systems long since cold. The very idea of gathering naked with strangers in a pool of water, once a hallmark of civilization, would now seem utterly alien, perhaps even scandalous. The emphasis has moved from public communal bathing to a more private, minimal approach to hygiene, driven by necessity, fear, and evolving cultural norms. The common historical fact that marks this transition is the gradual reemergence of public bathhouses, albeit on a much smaller scale and with different social functions than their Roman predecessors, and a renewed interest in personal cleanliness among certain segments of the population. While the grand thermae were largely gone, smaller, more private bathhouses, often associated with inns or even private homes, began to appear. These were not necessarily about communal bathing, but offered individuals or small groups a chance to wash in heated water. It was a cautious re-engagement with water, driven by a slowly evolving understanding of comfort and well-being. This transition wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, creeping change, spanning centuries. But by the height of the Middle Ages, the Roman legacy of widespread public bathing had largely vanished, replaced by a more cautious, less frequent, and often dry approach to personal cleanliness. The echoes of Roman luxury were faint, replaced by the pragmatic realities of a harsher, more uncertain world. You might stumble upon the remains of a grand bathhouse, imagining the laughter and conversations that once filled its halls, and feel a pang of wistful nostalgia for a lost era of cleanliness. Imagine a merchant, having traveled dusty roads, arriving at an inn that boasts a small, private bathing room. It's a far cry from the Roman baths, perhaps just a wooden tub in a cramped space, but the promise of warm water to wash away the grime of the journey is a welcome one. He might still be wary of opening his pores too much, perhaps opting for a quick wash rather than a long soak, but the very availability of such a service signals a change. A quick rinse, just to shake off the road dust, mind you, he might tell the innkeeper, still hedging his bets against the miasma. The fall of the Roman baths is a powerful symbol of how quickly societal norms and technological advancements can be lost or forgotten when the underlying infrastructure and cultural values no longer support them. It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, and that even something as fundamental as public hygiene can regress under the weight of changing circumstances. You might wonder, if they had known what we know about germs, would they have fought harder to keep those baths open? But that's a question for another time, another story. Here's a little-known detail that illustrates this slow shift, the development of more efficient heating technologies. Particularly improved chimneys and fireplaces made it easier and less costly to heat water in private dwellings. This practical advancement, though seemingly minor, played a crucial role in making personal bathing more feasible. No longer was it an enormous undertaking requiring vast amounts of fuel and labor. A small fire could heat enough water for a basin wash, or even a small tub. It's like the invention of the electric kettle after centuries of boiling water over an open fire. A small change, but one with significant implications for daily life. As you close your eyes, picture the silence descending upon those once bustling Roman baths. The steam no longer rises, the water no longer flows, and the laughter has long since faded. In its place, the quiet fear of the unseen, and the pragmatic acceptance of a less than spotless existence, settled over the land. It's a somber end to a glorious chapter in the history of hygiene, paving the way for the very different, and often misunderstood, bathing habits of the medieval world. The academic debate that continues among historians is the primary catalyst for this shift. Was it the slow decline of the Black Death's immediate terror, allowing for a relaxation of miasmatic fears? Was it the influence of new medical ideas emerging from the Islamic world, where bathing traditions were more continuous? Or was it simply a pragmatic response to increasing urbanization and the desire for greater comfort and perceived cleanliness? Historians still debate whether the change was primarily driven by intellectual shifts, practical innovations, or a simple human desire for a more pleasant existence. It's a complex interplay of factors, each contributing to the slow turning of the tide. With the decline of the Grand Roman Thermae and the pervasive fear of open pores, you find yourself adapting to a world where cleanliness takes on a very different meaning. If full immersion in water is deemed dangerous, what alternatives are left? This is where the ingenuity, or perhaps the sheer necessity, of medieval hygiene truly shines. You learn to embrace what we would call dry cleaning and the liberal use of fragrances. You can imagine the subtle changes in conversation. Instead of only discussing the dangers of water, people might tentatively begin to talk about the comfort of warm water, or the feeling of refreshment after a partial wash. The emphasis might shift from merely masking odors to actually removing some of the visible grime. It was a slow, almost imperceptible evolution in mindset, but one that paved the way for future changes. The common historical fact you'll encounter is that frequent changes of linen and the use of aromatic substances were primary methods of maintaining personal hygiene in the Middle Ages. Your inner garments, often made of linen or hemp, were your first line of defense against grime and body odor. These fabrics were relatively easy to wash and, more importantly, were believed to absorb the body's impurities and sweat. You'd change your shirt or shift regularly, perhaps even daily if you were of means, or at least every few days if you were a common laborer. Think of it as your personal, wearable sponge, soaking up the day's exertions. When you changed your linens, it was like shedding an old skin, taking with it the accumulated grime and the bad air that had been expelled from your body. The burgeoning trade networks of the late Middle Ages also played a role. As goods and ideas flowed more freely across Europe and beyond, so too did different cultural practices. Travelers returning from lands where bathing was more common might bring back new perspectives, slowly challenging the ingrained European aversion. While not immediately adopted, these external influences planted seeds of doubt in the old ways. You might hear tales from a returning merchant about the elaborate bathhouses of Constantinople, sparking a flicker of curiosity, even if tinged with suspicion. Imagine the feeling of pulling on a fresh, crisp linen shirt after days of wearing the same wool tunic. It might not be the invigorating sensation of a hot shower, but it would certainly offer a sense of renewed freshness, a temporary reprieve from the pervasive odors of medieval life. This practice wasn't just about comfort. It was a practical and widely accepted method of maintaining a semblance of cleanliness without resorting to the perceived dangers of water. You might even feel a quiet satisfaction, knowing you've done your part to keep the miasma at bay. The rise of a more affluent merchant class, particularly in burgeoning cities, also contributed. These individuals had the means and the desire for greater comfort and luxury, and a private bathing experience, however rudimentary, became a symbol of their rising status. It was a way to distinguish themselves from the common laborers, and to enjoy a small indulgence that was once almost unthinkable. My new home has a bathing room. A successful merchant might boast, a subtle flex of his newfound wealth. Here's a little-known detail that might surprise you some medieval households, particularly those of the wealthy, employed specialized servants whose sole task was to manage and air out clothing. These wardrobe keepers would meticulously brush garments, hang them in the fresh air, and even lightly beat them to remove dust and dirt. They might also use fragrant herbs or powders, to freshen the clothes between washes. It wasn't just about laundry. It was a sophisticated system of garment care designed to extend the life of expensive clothing and contribute to the overall perceived cleanliness of the wearer. You might even see them meticulously arranging a lord's furs, ensuring every hair was in place, not just for appearance, but for the subtle release of trapped odors. Even the understanding of disease, while still far from germ theory, began to evolve. Physicians started to observe patterns of illness that didn't always align perfectly with the miasma theory. While the old beliefs persisted, cracks began to appear in their monolithic dominance. The very real experience of cleanliness, even partial, might offer a sense of well-being that subtly challenged the notion that water was inherently dangerous. You might notice that after a good scrub, even if it was just your hands and face, you felt a little better, a little more invigorated, a feeling that slowly chipped away at the fear. The academic debate that continues among historians is the extent to which these dry methods of hygiene were genuinely effective in preventing disease, or if they were primarily psychological and social measures to manage odors and perceptions of cleanliness. While changing linen certainly helped with surface grime and comfort, they didn't address the underlying bacterial issues that modern washing does. Historians still debate whether these practices were a pragmatic adaptation to environmental constraints or a misguided attempt at disease prevention. It's a question of efficacy versus intent, and the answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. So, as the Middle Ages drew to a close and the dawn of the Renaissance approached, the rigid beliefs about bathing began to soften. It wasn't a sudden embrace of daily showers, but a cautious reevaluation, a slow chipping away at centuries of fear and practicality. The seeds of modern hygiene were being planted, nurtured by a combination of changing social structures, practical innovations, and a slowly expanding worldview. Beyond changing clothes, you would rely heavily on perfumes and aromatic substances. Remember the pomanders we discussed? These weren't just fashion accessories. They were essential tools in your daily fight against foul smells, which, to you, meant fighting disease. You'd carry them, wear them, or even place them strategically in your home. The stronger the scent, the better, as it was believed to overpower and neutralize the harmful miasma. You might even dab a bit of civet or musk behind your ears, not for allure, but for protection. As you drift off to sleep, consider this moment of transition. The medieval world, so deeply rooted in its fears and traditions, was beginning to stir, to question, to tentatively reach for new possibilities. The simple act of washing, once fraught with peril, was slowly, imperceptibly, shedding its dangerous reputation, paving the way for a future where cleanliness would become a cornerstone of health and well-being. It's a quiet, profound shift, a testament to humanity's enduring capacity for change and adaptation. The use of perfumes wasn't limited to the body. Your homes would be filled with fragrant herbs scattered on the floors, rushes, lavender, mint, and chamomile, which would release their scents when walked upon, masking unpleasant odors and, again, supposedly purifying the air. Incense would be burned, particularly in churches and during public gatherings, to create a more agreeable atmosphere and ward off perceived contagion. You'd walk into a great hall and be hit by a wave of mingled scents, wood smoke, roasting meat, and the sharp, sweet aroma of herbs underfoot. It was a sensory assault, but one designed for your protection. As the Renaissance blossomed and the early modern period dawned, the lingering shadows of medieval hygiene began to recede, though not without a long, drawn-out struggle. The beliefs about bathing that we've explored tonight, the fear of open pores, the miasma theory, the practical limitations, and the spiritual interpretations didn't vanish overnight. Instead, they slowly transformed, adapted, and were eventually supplanted by new understandings, laying the groundwork for the hygienic practices you take for granted today. Imagine a noblewoman meticulously applying a fragrant oil to her skin, not to cleanse, but to mask. Or a merchant pulling a perfumed handkerchief from his sleeve to hold to his nose as he navigates a crowded street. These weren't acts of vanity, but acts of survival. The nose was your first line of defense, and if something smelled bad, it was inherently dangerous. Better to smell like a rose than to smell like the plague. You might quip to a friend, sharing a wry smile. The common historical fact that marks this final chapter is the gradual but persistent shift towards a greater emphasis on personal cleanliness, driven by evolving medical understanding, technological advancements, and changing social norms. While it would still be centuries before germ theory fully took hold, the tangible benefits of washing, even if not fully understood scientifically, began to outweigh the lingering fears. The simple act of feeling refreshed and healthier after washing started to chip away at the old anxieties. Even your hair received special attention, though rarely with water. You might use dry powders, like finely ground herbs or even flour, to absorb grease and refresh your scalp. These powders could also be scented, adding another layer of fragrance. Brushing your hair thoroughly would help distribute these powders and remove loose dirt. It was a meticulous process, a daily ritual to maintain an appearance of order and cleanliness without the risky application of water. You might spend a good deal of time with a fine-toothed comb, not just for lice, but for general hair maintenance. Imagine yourself in a bustling 17th century city. The streets might still be far from pristine, but the scent of perfumes is more refined, and the sight of people washing their hands and faces more common. Private wash basins and Ewer's pitchers become standard household items, even for those of modest means. You might even see people using early forms of soap, often made from animal fat and ash, which, while harsh, offered a more effective cleanse than plain water. A good scrub with lye soap, that'll chase away the humors. A pragmatic housewife might declare, having found her own practical solution, the concept of clean was less about sterility and more about freshness and pleasant scent. If you smelled good, you were considered clean, regardless of how much actual dirt might be clinging to your skin beneath your layers of clothing. It was a social construct, a performance of hygiene rather than a scientific one. And in a world without germ theory, it made perfect sense. If disease was carried by bad smells, then good smells were your antidote. Here's a little-known detail that highlights the persistence of old beliefs even as new practices emerged even into the 18th century. Some medical practitioners still advised against full immersion baths for the infirm, fearing that the sudden change in temperature or the opening of pores could worsen their condition. The miasma theory, though increasingly challenged by empirical observation, clung on in various forms, particularly in explanations for epidemics. It's a bit like a stubborn old habit that just won't die, even when you know it's not good for you. You might still hear a whisper of caution. Don't get too hot in that bath, lest you catch a chill. This reliance on dry cleaning and perfumes also highlights the resourcefulness of medieval people. They adapted their hygiene practices to their environment and their understanding of the world. They didn't have running water in every home, or the scientific knowledge to understand microscopic pathogens, so they did what they could with the tools and beliefs they possessed. It's a testament to human adaptability, even in the face of widespread ignorance. The academic debate that continues to intrigue historians is the precise moment when the balance truly tipped, and the fear of bathing was definitively overcome by the desire for cleanliness. Was it the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and scientific inquiry? The Industrial Revolution's creation of new materials and technologies for plumbing and soap production, or the gradual accumulation of empirical evidence linking hygiene to health? Even without a full understanding of microbiology, historians still debate the specific tipping point, recognizing that it was a long, complex process rather than a single event. You might even find yourself participating in these rituals. Perhaps you help gather fresh rushes for the floor, or you learn to concoct a simple herbal sachet to hang in your sleeping quarters. These small acts of dry hygiene would become ingrained in your daily routine, as natural as eating or sleeping. They were your way of asserting some control over an unpredictable and often terrifying world. You can imagine the slow, almost imperceptible shift in public discourse. Instead of whispers of disease, you might hear conversations about the invigorating feeling of a wash, or the social benefits of smelling pleasant. Cleanliness slowly transitioned from a risky endeavor to a mark of respectability and good breeding. The idea of cleanliness is next to godliness began to take on a more literal physical meaning, rather than purely spiritual. You might even find yourself enjoying the feeling of fresh water on your skin, a sensation that would have filled your medieval ancestors with dread. The contrast with modern hygiene is striking. We seek to eliminate bacteria. They sought to mask miasma. We use water and soap to strip away dirt. They used fabrics and scents to absorb and cover it. It's a fundamental difference in approach, born from vastly different understandings of health and disease. You might think, if only they knew about hand washing. But that knowledge was centuries away. The rise of public health initiatives, though still in their infancy, also contributed. As cities grew, the problems of sanitation became undeniable, leading to early attempts at improving water supplies and waste removal. While these efforts were often rudimentary, they slowly began to reduce the actual dangers of contaminated water, making bathing less risky. It was a slow, painful learning curve, but one that gradually made the environment safer for more frequent washing. So, as you prepare to drift off, imagine a world where the sweet scent of lavender or the sharp aroma of rosemary is your primary defense against the unseen dangers of the air. A world where changing your shirt is a more significant act of hygiene than stepping into a bath. It's a world that smells different, feels different, and where the very definition of cleanliness is a fragrant, dry embrace. The development of new textiles and clothing fashions also played a part. Lighter, more washable fabrics became more common, encouraging more frequent laundering and, by extension, a greater focus on the body beneath. The heavy, layered woolens of the Middle Ages, which were difficult to clean, slowly gave way to garments that allowed for more air circulation and easier maintenance. It's like moving from a heavy winter coat to a light summer dress, a change that invites a different approach to personal care. As the fear of water and the embrace of dry cleaning took hold, another powerful force began to shape medieval attitudes towards the body and its cleanliness, the pervasive influence of the church. In a world where life was often short, brutal, and uncertain, the promise of salvation and eternal life offered a profound source of comfort and meaning. And with that promise came a set of beliefs about how to live a virtuous life, which often extended to personal habits. By the 19th century, with the advent of germ theory and the understanding of microscopic pathogens, the medieval fears of bathing would finally be fully debunked. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch provided the irrefutable evidence that disease was caused by germs, not miasma or open pores. This scientific revolution fundamentally changed the way humanity viewed health, illness, and, crucially, hygiene. You would finally understand why washing your hands was so important, not just to mask odors, but to literally remove the invisible killers. The common historical fact here is that Christian asceticism, particularly in its more extreme forms, often emphasized spiritual purity over bodily cleanliness. While not all Christians abandoned bathing entirely, there was a strong current of thought that viewed excessive attention to the physical body, including elaborate bathing rituals, as a worldly indulgence, a distraction from the true path to God. The focus shifted from external cleanliness to internal, moral purity. You might hear sermons that praised saints who lived lives of extreme austerity, neglecting their bodies in favor of spiritual devotion. So, the legacy of the medieval fear of bathing is a complex one. It reminds us of the power of prevailing scientific theories, even when flawed, to shape human behavior. It highlights the profound impact of environmental factors, like contaminated water, on societal norms. And it underscores the slow, often painful-ass journey of scientific discovery and cultural evolution. The next time you step into a warm, steamy shower, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of misunderstanding and fear that had to be overcome for that simple act to become a symbol of health and comfort. It's a testament to how far we've come, and how much we still have to learn from the past. And now, as the tales of medieval terror fade into the night, let your mind drift gently. Imagine the flickering candles fading, the rough stone walls softening in the soft darkness, the scent of burning wood and herbs giving way to the silence of the night. A silence you can feel deeply in every breath. Let any worries about miasma or open pores melt away like morning dew. Your body is wrapped in the warmth and safety of your bed, no longer worried about invisible threats from water or air. Remember, you live in a different world, a world where cleanliness is not a curse, but a blessing. Let the misunderstandings of the past become a gentle lullaby, lulling you into a deep sleep. Relax every muscle from your toes to the top of your head, feeling the peace envelop you. All tension melts away, all thoughts subside. You are safe, you are protected, and you are completely clean. Imagine a monk in a remote monastery, dedicating his life to prayer and contemplation. His days are spent in quiet devotion, his meals are simple, and his possessions are few. For him, a daily bath would not only be impractical due to limited resources, but also potentially seen as a sign of vanity or attachment to worldly comforts. His cleanliness would be measured not by the sparkle of his skin, but by the purity of his soul. You might see him with dusty robes and unkempt hair, yet his eyes would hold a serene light, reflecting a different kind of inner glow.